Namaste and welcome to Youth in Development, produced by Today's Youth Asia. In the TV show Youth in Development, we bring young leaders face to face with the key players of development works. My name is Drishti. Today we have the privilege of having with us Mr. Brandon H. Doherty, a Special Assistant of the U.S. State Department for the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. He has also served as the Chief of Party of Public International Law and Policy Group.
I'm American. I grew up in the Northeast United States in a very small town, actually. It only had about 7,000 people in it. So in many ways, it's probably like some of the very small villages here in Nepal where you grow up in a situation where it's very hard to conceive of going to another country, of doing things like what I'm doing now. Many of my friends, who I'm still extremely close with from childhood, they still live in that small town, and so it's always so fascinating to go back. And after going to Nepal, after living here, after spending time in Africa, and to go back and to see them again, and to interact and to share some of the experiences. So I think, even though obviously our countries are different, there are of course incredible similarities too in terms of the family and in terms of places that we can grow up in. After I grew up there, I went to university at a public university and studied philosophy. I finished and I had no idea what I wanted to do after that. I in fact thought I wanted to manage hotels and restaurants. I love to entertain. I love to have my friends over, and doing something like hospitality seemed to me like the right profession to go into. But I spent the next couple of years after my bachelor's degree doing so many different things. I traveled across the United States. I lived in California. I was a scuba dive instructor for about a year in Latin America, and eventually settled in San Diego, where I worked in an adolescent group home with severely emotionally and mentally frustrated youth, actually. So ages 13 to 18 years old. They had all been incredibly abused, verbally and physically, by their families, by people who claimed to be their friends. And because of it, they had had quite a few challenges growing up, and they were placed by the California government in a home to be rehabilitated. And so I spent about a year in that group home working with them, seeing the challenges they faced, and trying to better understand where they had come from, and see if I couldn't provide some level of trust and empathy and understanding, and then encouragement for them to aspire to be something different. Ultimately, though, and I think this was one of the most important experiences actually of going there, was that I learned that being in an environment like that is actually not my strength. I found it very, very emotionally exhausting, and I found that many of these youth came from very, very different backgrounds than I came from, and it became very difficult actually to connect with many of them in some ways. And I realized that even though inside of myself I wanted to work with populations of people, with individuals who had experienced great hardship, that in fact it was not the type of people that perhaps I could have the greatest impact with. And so what I did at that point was I started to think about what else I might want to do. And that was when I began talking to many of my mentors. And I encourage all of you, as I had said before, that it's so incredibly important to find mentors in your life, to find individuals who you can identify with, who you respect, and even sometimes people who are doing things that you aspire to do, because they can give you the advice and the insights that can prevent you from making some of the same mistakes they made, but also just kind of help you think about what are your passions and how maybe to apply them. And when I did that, I found that perhaps one of the areas that might help me fulfill one of my passions and work with populations that are disadvantaged is to follow law. And for some of you it may be social work, it may be urban development or rural development, it may be any number of fields, but for me I realized that perhaps law would be a vehicle that would allow me to provide the type of advocacy and support for minorities and marginalized populations and historically disadvantaged populations that I felt passionate about. So I encourage all of you to identify, as I said before, what are your passions, what are your interests, and then work back from that. Say, how do I get there then? What would help me to arrive at a place where I'm happy with, waking up in the morning and going to work? And I know that there's probably pressure, as there was on me, to find work and a job that pays bills and that can provide for family, because that's absolutely important. But at the same time, you can balance that, and you can do something where you're engaged and you're inspired and you're active, but you're also able to earn a living and a profession, because it's always that incredible balance. So law, for me, became that vehicle, became that path to a profession. So I finished law school, and during law school I worked in Africa, actually, for the United Nations, in what's called the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. In 1994, Rwanda had a very horrific genocide, which I'm sure many of you know about. And the international community came together and set up a court to try those most responsible for the genocide and also for other crimes. So I went and worked with there, and I worked directly with many of the victims of the Rwandan genocide who had come to the court to testify. And if you think of maybe, for many of you who maybe grew up outside of Kathmandu, what it was like for the first time you came to Kathmandu from a small town. For me, it was the equivalent of growing up in my small town of 7,000 people and going to my capital, Boston, for the very first time. For many of these people, these victims who were coming to testify at the court, not only were they leaving their village of maybe 600 people, but they were getting on an airplane for the first time. They were flying for 3 hours from Rwanda all the way to Tanzania, getting in a big vehicle with the UN, and then coming before the court and testifying about how their family had been killed, about how their brothers and their sisters had been abused. And the entire experience was, on the one hand, extremely tragic and traumatizing for them, but on the other, it became an inspiration, actually, for their village to stand up against the injustices and to testify and be willing to come all this way to tell her story or his story. And so, for me, I often use that as an inspiration in my work at the State Department and in my work here in Nepal, where I try to imagine what it must have been like for someone who had experienced such incredible hardship and tragedy, and to leave that small, comfortable environment of family, of the support network there, and travel all the way to a foreign country to tell their story in hopes that there might be some justice. And I use that as an inspiration for me when I'm here in Nepal, when I'm thousands of kilometers from my family and my home and things that I know very well. I often think back on that and use that as a way of saying, you know what, those people are so incredibly strong, more strong than I am, and I want to draw on that and try to be like them and to also help others inspire themselves to challenge themselves. So that's just a very little bit about my background, and I'm really looking forward to actually having an interaction. My style is very much one of discussion.
We, all the youths of Nepal, would like to know about your experience you are having while working with our policymakers that are leaders and professionals from various government organizations. Thank you for your question. It's an excellent question. I've been here about 1 year now, and as Kalyani had mentioned, I'm the Chief of Party of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and we provide legal and technical support to a whole range of actors on the constitutional process, and then also on the future processes like transition to the new constitution and implementation of that new constitution. So in that role, I end up interacting actually quite frequently with a lot of policymakers and legislators, civil society actors, organizations like Today's Youth Asia, on a variety of these issues. We do that interaction, in fact, a lot here at the central level in Kathmandu, but we also do quite a lot of it in the field. Just last week, 2 weeks ago actually, I was in Janakpur, where I met with other youth in Janakpur, as well as teachers and farmers and women's cooperatives, students who were extremely excited to see us and put tika all
on our forehead. I think I didn't get it off for about a week. I had a little pink dot on my forehead for about a week. But it was such an honor to be their guest and to participate in such incredibly culturally significant ceremonies, and to be in these places where, you know, you're inspired by the people you're around. So as an organization, but also as the chief of party for the Public International Law and Policy Group, we have interactions with a very, very broad group of stakeholders. Some are very frustrated with the current processes here in Nepal right now. They envision a better Nepal, and one that is protecting the minorities, that is allowing economic development, and not just allowing, but in fact building and progressing it and adding a fertile ground for it. And there's others who are working hard at that, but are finding themselves challenged by any number of circumstances. And I think, you know, one of the most important things that I've drawn from my interactions with, as you said, some of the policymakers, is that though there is immense frustration, I think, with many of the politicians right now, and I think a lot of it is quite reasonable, at the same time there are many who are also working hard to try to make Nepal a better place, to draft a constitution. And I think, you know, when we look, even in my own country, when I look at you know, policymakers, legislators, civil society leaders, it's sometimes very easy to look at them as one large group. But in fact, among all of them, there's such a variety of different people, and of those that are really working very hard, and others who perhaps not as much so. And I think, you know, what I always try to do when I talk about, you know, my experiences here in Nepal and the people I've worked with, is to really try to convey the diversity of people I work with. And I think that's helps to further the conversation. So thank you for your question, and it's an inspiring group of people that we work with here as an organization.
You have been to Kathmandu. Recently you visited to the Tarai part of our country, Nepal. How do you analyze Nepal now?
Nepal is an extraordinarily diverse country. I think that's one of the most incredible impressions that I have after visiting different districts all around Nepal. There is, you know, over 90 languages and dialects, over 90 ethnicities here in Nepal, and each one of those has their own unique aspects and characteristics. So it's impossible to stay, you know, just in Kathmandu and expect to know what is Nepal. Obviously, Kathmandu very much is one piece of what a Nepal is, but getting outside of there is equally important. When we were in Janakpur, for instance, about 2 weeks ago, we went and visited a government-funded school, an all-girls school. The students there, many of them came from incredible, from circumstances that are incredibly challenging. So they had fathers and mothers who worked very, very long hours in the fields as farmers, others who are rickshaw drivers, some who are fruit sellers, and they're all extremely proud, as they should be, of their profession, and very committed and work very hard, but may not have the income and the money to want what is best for their children. And so in many environments like that, I would have expected perhaps that they would ask their daughters and their sons to stay and work in the fields, and that, you know, that is the way, of course, to try to provide for the family. But the opposite was true when I arrived at these schools. I sat down and I talked with these girls. It was an all-girls school, ages, I think, 5 to maybe 17 or 18. And each one of them were there because their parents believed in the power of education and in the power of making sure that their girls weren't working in the home during the school day, weren't asked to go to the fields, but in fact showed up each day and studied their subjects and studied hard, because as a community they saw the education as the way out, as the way out of the poverty that has struck many of them. And I think that, to me, actually was one of the most inspiring and incredible windows into cultures and people and communities in the Terai, and other places here in Nepal was that, it's a universal thing to want what's best for your children. And I think, all of you here today, have come from an incredible diversity of backgrounds, and yet you're all here and doing this work together and trying to build a better Nepal for you and yourselves. And just as much as it's a credit to all of you here, it's a credit to your parents also. And so I think going to the TYA helped sort of show me very, very firsthand what it means to see that family and community coming together to support their young people and their youth. And that left me with a very large smile, quite a lot of tika, and a better understanding of what an entire Nepal looks like.
In Nepal, lots of youths don't focus on international relations. They usually go for science stream. So what would you like to tell those youths?
I would say that there is room for all of those professions and passions here in Nepal. I think that in many countries, including my own, international relations and the globalization issues are very new. They're issues that really came to the forefront of the international community in the 90s, when we all suddenly realized how connected we were financially, culturally, politically, and that in many ways our destinies are linked that way. And so I think what you see now in Nepal, which is what you see in also quite a lot of countries, in fact, is that the youth are suddenly, through Facebook and through Twitter and through the internet, are feeling so connected to other people around the world and inspired by them and wanting to do some of the same things and have some of the same opportunities that they see in other countries that they also see in their own country. And so thankfully, I think many of the technology advances are allowing that greater interaction and allowing many of Nepal's youth to now pursue careers in international relations. And I think what I would say to them is that to follow that, and that you'll meet other people out there who are like yourself in that they're committed and dedicated and bright and want to see a better future for their own country and for their community and their family. So I encourage them to follow that trajectory.
What should be the key role of the Nepal lawmakers in the development of Nepal?
The lawmakers of Nepal are a unique mandate in the sense that they're both lawmakers, parliamentarians, but also constituent assembly members. And by that, it means they have a very important mandate, which is to draft a new constitution for Nepal, and we're elected for that purpose. So I think every day I interact with many of these constituent assembly members here in Nepal, and there are 601 of them, and in 601 members you'll find 601 different opinions and backgrounds and ideas on what the Constitution and what Nepal should look like. But I think despite all those differences, my message is that there needs to be a compromise on the way forward. And in my country, when we were drafting a constitution, we had, in fact, a very, very lively debate on what our country should look like. There were some that felt there should be a strong central government, and others that felt that the states had to have all the power. And there were others who felt like there needed to be a very specific Bill of Rights, 10 of them, that laid out what the individuals had so that the government wouldn't intrude on that. And so, in the end, the discussions became an incredible compromise between the different lawmakers. And here in Nepal, that is the only way forward, is to find ways to work together and identify, be realistic in identifying where they agree and where they don't agree, and in those areas of disagreement to work for a compromise, because right now it's holding hostage your future, and that future is important to all youth here in Nepal and globally. So that would be my message to many of the lawmakers, and I think I do that. I talk with them about that, and many of them are very committed to looking to resolve the deadlock.
What would you suggest for those students who are planning to study law in the future?
Yeah, I would, for those students who are interested in studying law, I would say that you first have to ask yourself if it's what you're passionate about. I think that it's a field that sometimes has a bad reputation. I think that there's a sense that maybe some lawyers will can and have used the law in every country, in fact, to, instead of for a greater purpose or common good, or for an individual, to seek justice or redress, use it instead for political gain or for their own personal advantage or financial success. And what I would say to that is that's true in not only every country but every profession. And that what's most important is whatever profession you do go into, that you do it with a passion for what you're interested in, but also a commitment to the profession. And law is a very special one because it gives you a set of tools to operate here in Nepal, to assess problems, and to see solutions through policy making, through law making, and allows you to advocate very effectively for that in your country, and soon perhaps in a global community. So if law is what you're interested in, I would say absolutely, it can be a very noble profession, especially it's all in who it is that's practicing it. But I would also offer that if social work or rural development or other areas of what you're interested in, that those too can bring change, that there's room for science and technology and social work. Because each one of those, the diversity, the sort of change makers will come from each of those fields. So simply follow what it is that will bring about the change that you want to see in your world. And I think that's what will be most important. Thank you.
I want to ask, what is your message for the youth of Nepal?
I want you to speak with your own voice. I think that often in any country, and Nepal is no different, the youth feel like just because they are young, and perhaps they haven't yet had the experiences of their parents or of the people that they admire, that means they don't have the voice, or that they don't have the ability to speak on behalf of a group of people. And I would tell you that that's wrong. That those of you in here today are a very clear example to me about youth that are engaged and want to make a difference here in Nepal. And what I would do is really encourage you to find each other, to seek individuals who are in your peer group, who are going to be leaders, yourselves who will be leaders, some who will be supporters, that through this network that you can build, that finding the way to express what is important to you and to convince, and again, I mean, I think, some of in my country, for instance, when I was growing up, it was difficult to imagine that one day I would be a lawyer here in Nepal, talking to you and talking with parliament members. I mean, coming from a town of 7,000 people, it's hard to imagine, actually. And yet here I am today, speaking with you, invited by you, honored to be here speaking with you, and it's happened. And so I would so much encourage you to think, to think ahead, to think that, what, just because today maybe I'm still trying to figure out what it is I want to do, or where I want to go, that in many ways you'll find yourself there suddenly in 10 years, and it will be because you worked together and you supported each other and you identified what was important to the youth and spoke that. And Nepal, I think, is at a point in its history and its politics where it really needs the voice of the youth. And I think you are the voice of change, and you're also the voice that recognizes that the new Nepal is in fact your Nepal. And it needs to be a Nepal that's responsive to all of the diversity of it. And I think you here are a tribute to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brendan H. Doherty, for being with us today and for sharing your insightful thoughts and ideas. Thank you for watching us. We look forward to your feedback. Our email address is youthtya@gmail.com. We'll be back next week at the same time. Have a nice week. Namaste.